अच्छे अभी
Good afternoon from Jakarta and hello to everyone joining from other parts of the world. Hope you're having a good day. Welcome to the 6th series of Global Town Hall on the Rising Tides, China's Rise and its Global Implications. My name is Dianova and I will be the Master of Ceremony for today's discussion. In addition to the annual flagship event, the Global Town Hall has now convened regular smaller-scale discussions intended to create a platform for conversation among the civil societies. The theme of the discussion will range from geopolitics, climate, food security, technology, and many more. Please look forward to the upcoming Global Town Hall series. Today, I'm pleased to welcome over 200 registered participants to this discussion. We have attendees coming from more than 20 countries, to name some but not all: Angola, Bangladesh, Australia, Canada, Mali, Spain, the UK, and many more, making this an actual global town hall. Today's discussion will look into what China's rise to become one of the defining features of the 21st century world system means to the rest of the world. We have the pleasure of welcoming Cobus van Staden, Senior Research Affiliate from South African Institute of International Affairs, Managing Editor of the China Global South Project. And then we also have Dr. Siren Arjun, Research Fellow of the Foreign Policy Unit at Center for European Policy Studies. We also have Julia Ganter, Kober Emerging Middle Powers Initiative Program Director and Editor-in-Chief of the Berlin Pulse Kober Stiftung. Now, without further ado, allow me to hand over the discussion to our moderator, Dr. Dinopati Jalal, founder and chairman of Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia. Pak Dino, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dianova. I want to say hello to everybody. This is Dino Jalal. I'm actually in Copenhagen, where it's very, very sunny. It's been sunny for, I think, 3 days. And, you know, my mom used to say that I'm the God's son, you know, and like sun, right? And I didn't believe that, but now I think I'm beginning to believe that everywhere I go, you know, the sun shines, right? So Julia, wait for me in Berlin. I'll bring the sun to Berlin soon. Good. So we have a very interesting discussion. We've always wanted to do this dialogue, about the rise of China, and I really wanted to get a good, cold, rational discussions about what the rise of China means to the rest of the world. And as a former diplomat, I do notice there is a different view of China, how China is seen from the West, from the global South, certain parts of the global South, and other parts of the global South. There is just a very nuanced views, sometimes very sharp, contrasting views of China. So I'd like to get a deep dive on these perspectives, and there's no question that China's rise has been the most significant geopolitical and geoeconomic phenomenon that has happened to our world system. I come from Southeast Asia, and there's virtually no Southeast Asian country that can say that what happens in China is irrelevant to their national development and foreign policy. And China's presence is felt not just in the nearby region, but throughout the world. You know, as far away as Latin America, you have China's trading and economic presence there, in Africa, in Middle East, in South Asia, and definitely in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, right? So this is going to be very interesting discussions, and I think I will begin with the first question that I'd like to ask to Dr. Cobus van Staden from South Africa, and then I would like to get the other two panelists to respond to the same question, which is, how does the rise of China mean? What does the rise of China mean to your country? Yeah, how does your country see this? Yeah, please, Dr. Cobus.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. It's fantastic to join everyone. So I am South African, and the rise of China has been very complicated in South Africa. And so on the one hand, I think a lot of global South countries, and South Africa particularly, I think see the rise of China as an opportunity, not necessarily to join with China or to, to align themselves with China, but more because China offers, I think China, partly China's role is as a kind of disruptor, I think, of the current global system. But I think in for the global South and for countries like South Africa, they also see a lot of opportunity in that disruption. So on the one hand, kind of what you find is that that the that South Africa obviously has had a long and very close relationship with Europe and with the United States. South Africa I think in a lot of ways, I think Western power has shaped South Africa in complicated ways. On the one hand, I think in a lot of ways, the South Africa's human rights revolution that came with its democratization in the mid-90s was very, very fundamentally influenced by Western thinking. South Africa's rights-based constitution, for example, and ideas about equity and inclusive growth and so on that came with that was very fundamentally influenced by Western power. On the other hand, apartheid that structured South African society, from the colonial era onwards, was also very closely related to Western power, and to a large extent actually propped up by particularly the United States and United Kingdom, kind of in the last decade or so, like in the 1980s, when it was looking very shaky within South Africa. So there's a lot of complicated feelings in South Africa about Western power, and the rise of China happens in that space, and kind of like changes a lot of dynamics in that space. So in Africa, particularly, China has been a huge build of infrastructure, and in the process, it was really transformative in some African countries, and in the process, it also opened the door to a lot of other emerging powers. And in the process, also highlighted what wasn't happening in Africa's relationship with Western power. So there wasn't, for example, a lot of infrastructure building coming from Western power until China basically changed that landscape, and then Western power responded, as we're now seeing with initiatives like the Global Gateway from Europe. So so in that sense, like I think there is some misgivings in Africa, I think, about China, about the rise of China. Particularly what we see is that even though kind of China is in a lot of ways, I think, has a lot more positive response in Africa, like, generally, kind of in polling, the United States and China poll as relatively equally popular, and China is frequently a little more popular in Africa. But at the same time, one also sees that Africans aren't necessarily integrating Chinese ideas of governance and democracy, for example. So Africans in these same polls, you would find Africans to say no, they actually do want democracy. They want kind of like electoral democracy, kind of Western style electoral democracy, even as China is very popular frequently as a development partner. So I think what one sees is that China is rearranging the kind of global position that Africa finds itself in, and that opens a lot of opportunities. But I think it also opens some worries in Africa about, particularly around issues of governance and how kind of how the global system is going to continue in the future. So I'll stop there for the moment, and then kind of like looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, thank you. That's very useful. Let me turn now to Julia. Julia, how does Germany see the rise of China?
Thank you, Gino. And I have to deliver an important message in the beginning, namely that it is actually already sunny in Berlin. So nevertheless, I would be happy to welcome you here, but we already have the sun. So I feel that I have to improve the reputation of my city. But to come back to your question, so you have mentioned in your introduction that there's different views, and I think already hearing from Cobus about South Africa, now I share my view coming from Germany. Our audience today here will see that really already between those two countries there's huge differences. So I think for Germany, when we think about the rise of China and what it means to our country, first of all, it means that we have to really rethink our bilateral relationship, because today's China is different from China in the 1980s and also in the early 2000s. And I'd say that the rise of China has an effect on Germany in at least 3 areas, for sure, on the economy, but also our international expectations towards China, and then also on security. So to come briefly, say briefly a couple of words on these 3 areas. The first on the economy. Germany is a trading power. So of course, China's rise impacts us heavily. Our trade volume with China last year was 253 billion euro, which is an amount that almost doubled in the last 10 years. And 10% of our goods go to China. So it's the biggest, second biggest export market after the US. So there's huge benefits for Germany when it comes to the rise of China. And for a long time, Germany and China, their economies were complementary. Now, what we see in rather recent times is that we become competitors. And if you look at strategic papers, and this is true for the EU as well as for German strategic papers on China, we look at China in a threefold manner. China as a partner, but also as a competitor and as a systemic rival. And this is why with China's rise increasingly here in Germany, we look at dependencies and we look at economic risks. And this is also why diversification and de-risking have become so big buzzwords in Berlin and also in Brussels. I think between all the differences that we have in our China policy still, this is something that really unites us, at least when you look at the strategic ideas, what is written in all those papers. However, I think we have come to a tipping point, to quote some of the colleagues working on these issues, because after a peak in exports, they fell by 9% in 2023, despite the continued economic growth in China. So I think we can see this also in our car industry, that is really where China really is a crucial market, because the Chinese market grows, but our car industry is selling less in China. So we kind of have reached a tipping point. So much on the economy. Now, I've also mentioned that we have to consider our international expectations when we think about China's rise. And I'd say that international expectations of China here in Germany have increased. China is already a large contributor to peacekeeping missions, but in Germany, we also expect that China plays a crucial role when we look at current conflicts. Of course, first of all, from a European point of view in Ukraine, China has, and Putin is at this very moment in Beijing, China has some channels to Russia, and in Germany we have the expectation that it also uses these channels. Maybe we can talk about the feasibility of this later in the discussion, but also when it comes to Gaza, Yemen, Sudan, so many places in the world where I think Germany has an increasing expectation of China also taking on more responsibility when it comes to its rise. And last, I mentioned security implications. What has definitely changed with China's rise is that we monitor more closely China's behavior and actions here in Germany. There were just recently some people arrested because of some spying activities. We are facing cyber attacks increasingly also coming from China. There was a coverage of 2 overseas police stations in Germany. So I think this is something that also takes place when a country is on a rise, that is increases its capacities in these areas. And I think this is also something that becomes more relevant to Germany in terms of monitoring.
Thank you, Julia. Now I turn to Dr. Seren. How is the rise of China seen from Turkey's perspective?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm also hailing from Europe, like Julia, from Brussels and Barcelona at the same time, but I am actually going to talk about Turkey's perspective when it comes to China's rise, where I'm originally from. Turkey has, let me say, mixed feelings towards China's rise. On the one hand, it welcomes this development as a sign of rising multipolarity in the world system in terms of a less Western-centric world, and because it's a timely development for Turkey, which is trying to branch out from its traditionally Western-centric foreign policy. Turkey used to be a staunch NATO member during the Cold War years, and it has been a candidate state for the European Union for many decades. And therefore, its foreign policy was quite unipolar in this sense between NATO and the EU. However, in the last 2 decades or so, with the lessening effect of Cold War, rise of multipolarity, and also diminishing hopes for EU membership, the Turkish governments have been trying to have a more multipolar foreign policy, and the emphasis being on less Western-centric and more Asia-focused. There was even a so-called Asia pivot of Turkey at some point in 2000s. Whether or not it was successful is a different issue, but China's rise coincides with these international ambitions of Turkey. In this sense, Turkey welcomes China as a rising power in the international system and is willing to cooperate with China both in China's Belt and Road Initiative in its own region, and also other international engagements such as Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS, for example. So there is that, but while Turkey welcomes any attempts for non-Western multipolarity in the international system, China is not necessarily the emerging power that Turkey would like to see on stage. And that's due to the historical legacy of the Uyghur issue. China's Uyghur minority in Xinjiang has historical linguistic, religious, ethnic ties with Turkey, and also a historical link of migration and asylum after the 49 revolution, after the establishment of the PRC. So there is a sizable Uyghur diaspora in Turkey, and the headquarters of the East Turkestan movement, political movement, used to be in Turkey, in Istanbul, actually. And at some point in late 90s, early 2000s, the Turkish government decided to prioritize its relationship with the Chinese state, with the rising China, instead of the Uyghur diaspora, and at the expense of the Uyghur diaspora. And push the diaspora leadership out of the country. So today there's this duality within Turkey that the governments are committed to have constructive relationship with the Chinese state, and rising China as an economic and political power, increasingly so political power. But there is a large base for public support for the Uyghur cause in Turkey, which becomes a political pressure on all the political parties concerned. So it is difficult for the governments of any denomination, for that matter, even though, of course, there's the same government for the last 2 decades in Turkey, the AKP government. It is difficult to actually have a single-handedly China-centered or pro-China foreign policy for Turkey because of these domestic pressures about the Uyghur issue. And also, so there's that, and also going back to the first point of this this quest for multipolarity, it is easier said than done for Turkey, having been a very Western-centric country. The economic and institutional ties with the EU in particular actually prevents Turkey to join the ranks of other global South countries to have a more intensive relationship with China within the context of, say, Xi Jinping's recent initiatives, such as the Global Development Initiative or Global Security Initiative. So Turkey, in this sense, is a cusp state. It is on the periphery of China's rise, let me say.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That's very interesting. History has shown that on many occasions when the new powers who come to the top, the global consequences can be unsettling. Usually, it's not a smooth process. You know, we understand the opportunities associated with the phenomenal economic growth of China, now the second largest economy in the world, and soon to be taking over or surpassing the United States as the largest economy in the world. But I'd like to get some comments on what are the risks that you see associated with China's rise. Maybe I'll start with the with South Africa, Dr. With sorry, Dr. Kobus, please.
It's a very interesting question. I think South Africa, I think I think South Africa is similar to Turkey in the sense that it's that it welcomes multipolarity. I think just as in and of itself, kind of they welcome more choices, a greater diversity of powers, and not being kind of locked into a kind of a unipolar kind of situation. I think in relation to the risks, I think there's also some worry in South Africa about, for example, the exporting of, for example, like internet rules, like Chinese kind of internet regulation, for example. I think there's frequently South Africa is a very kind of complex country, and there's a lot of different. It's difficult in South Africa to really kind of isolate a single kind of public view, like of any particular issue because South African society is so fractured. But kind of I think there are kind of strong kind of philosophical issues playing out in South Africa around whether the country should be aligning itself more with China and other kind of global South powers, even if there are, some illiberal powers in there, or whether South Africa should, kind of stay with a kind of a Western and liberal kind of, kind of perspective. In practice, it ends up kind of being a little bit a mix of both, and it can sometimes be quite incoherent. But I think in terms of the risk, I think there's both risks, I think like perceived risks around the weakening of certain kind of certain global standards around for example, environmental, social, and governance rules for projects, around kind of conceptions of human rights, around conceptions of internet freedom and free speech, for example. At the same time, I think the additional risks that I think people are also worried about are increasingly how the global South is going to be impacted by traditional Western powers' reaction to the rise of China. So it's not only the rise of China itself, but it is how the rise of China is, what the kind of knock-on effects are being caused in Washington and in Europe, and how those will then translate and land on the global South. So in a climate context, for example, Look, I can totally see that, economies like the United States and some European economies, I can totally see why they are so worried about, for example, the large amount of electric vehicles, kind of moving from China into the world. But however, from the Global South perspective, particularly from the Global South perspective, as they face a huge climate crisis, cheap solar panels, cheap electric vehicles, all of those things are a massive social good. So I think there's some worries, I think, in the Global South about how, tariffs or other kind of punitive kind of measures how those are gonna reverberate through the global system. And also just increasingly worried about what seems to be a kind of a drumbeat around a full securitization, kind of a geostrategic view of China's involvement in the Global South that I think is causing a lot of issues in the Global South. So for example, a lot of, I've been looking a lot at energy partnerships and, kind of, particularly comparing between EU and China's engagement around energy issues in Africa. And one of the things that I found was that African stakeholders, are very worried frequently about the rhetoric coming out of Europe and the United States around having to displace Chinese influence or just displace China from supply chains, for example, because from the Global South perspective, China is playing an important role and the BRI is playing an important role, and they want that role to be complementary with the Global Gateway or with PGI or other Western-led kind of infrastructure provision, initiatives. They don't want the two to be in conflict, and they don't want to be under pressure to be choosing one or the other, or to be, for example, ripping out perfectly good Chinese internet networks because they're facing pressure from the United States. Because they already don't have enough internet networks to begin with, so they want kind of help from the West to add more that could then synergize with what China has already added. So it just has the Global South has a very different perspective, I think, of this, particularly because they are facing this overlap of a massive developmental backlog with a huge climate crisis, particularly in Africa, which overlaps with a very young population. So we are literally looking at a very young population trying to work out what their future is going to be like in the midst of a huge development climate crisis. And in that context, they want inputs from China and they want inputs from the West, and they want those to work together. And increasingly, both China and Western powers, I think, are pulling away from that vision. And that, I think, is raising a lot of worries in the Global South.
Yeah, thank you, Cobus. And I do also see that if the West attempts to pressure a country in the Global South for dealing with China, that will be counterproductive. I think that will end up whoever is doing the pressuring, that not just counterproductive, but it will end up pushing that country closer to the other side. And I think if China were to do that same pressure to the Global South, then the response would also be the same, right? I think we're seeing that in the case of the China, Philippine, and U.S. Triangular relations. But Julia, your comment on the risks associated with China's rise.
Yeah, thank you, Dino. I would, because Cobus just mentioned that for South Africa welcomes multipolarity, and therefore also the rise of China is kind of seen in a very positive manner in general, like from a starting point. I would say that it's maybe too much to say that Germany welcomes multipolarity, because there's always the risk of the doubt how this emerging powers will kind of shift the current global order. However, if you listen closely to the German leadership, you will see that they, even if they might not welcome it, they for sure accept the fact that it's happening and that we have to embrace it. And I think that some of the if you look at the traveling diplomacy of the chancellor, of the foreign minister, and of many other ministers, you can see that there is more recently really an outreach to many countries who would classify for one of those powers who would then form other poles beside the US and maybe China or the European Union. So I think there's kind of a perspective that we also have to embrace this increasing multipolarity, and that there is a realization that it's happening. When it comes to the risks associated with China, from a German perspective, I really have to go back to economic issues, because if you look at the risking strategies at the moment, they're really focused on several economic factors. If you look at numbers, there's some numbers from the OECD that, for example, 450,000 German manufacturing jobs depended on the Chinese demand in 2020. If you look at the green transformation, which is a big issue, we see that we have an import dependency with 92% of raw earth and 97% of lithium from China, two resources very essential for making this green transformation happening. And I've mentioned the German automotive industry, and Kobus has also mentioned especially the e-vehicles as an issue that is hotly debated between Europe and China at the moment. There's also a lot of dependency in the sector when it comes to market and so on. So I think the risk from a German perspective when it comes to China's rise is that we have these dependencies, and that we kind of have the experience when it comes to Russia, especially that being very dependent on one country in a specific sector causes big problems. We have lived through this experience recently with the invasion of Ukraine, when we try to decouple, and this is not something that people want to do with China, but in the case of Russia, we had to, when we tried to decouple very quickly from Russian oil and gas. So this experience is very vivid, and it kind of has an impact on our risk analysis when it comes to our dependencies towards China. And besides the economic factors, I would say that one issue that is also monitored as kind of a risk is China's interest to flex its muscle, because we also, again, looking at Russia, we see that with them there might be situations where countries become ambitious and expansionist. So in Germany, people monitor closely what Xi Jinping says about Taiwan, and he said in the past that China must and will be reunited and reserves its right to use force. So this is a quote that I'm just citing here from Xi Jinping. And this kind of wording is closely monitored too in Germany when it comes to China's posture towards Taiwan.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. Actually, I'm in Copenhagen. I'm attending this Copenhagen Democracy Summit, and I hear a lot of talk where they put Russia and China in the same box. Yeah. I would like to ask Dr. Sear, again, in the context of risks and so on, is this an accurate thing to do, to place China and Russia in the same box? I mean, I'm asking this because last time I went to Beijing 2 months ago, the Chinese were speaking in ways that look, we have our own policies. We may look friendly towards Russia, but we do we move based on our interests, and we're not necessarily allies of Russia. So again, what is your comment on that, Dr. Sear?
Hi, thank you. So let me talk about Turkey, the risks that Turkey perceive from China's rise, and I'm happy to come back on putting China and Russia together in the same baskets in the region, because Turkey is very region, right? It is traditional neighborhoods. So Turkey is actually facing the immediate consequences of the Ukraine war and China's involvement in that. the risk that Turkey perceives from China's rise is twofold, mainly. One is that since currently Turkey lacks a clear industrial policy, macro planning for the new technologies, digital and green transformations, and China most certainly does have an industrial policy made in China 2025. And the Belt and Road Initiative is being used to promote these twin transformations of China, especially recently. China has the capacity, the ability, and the intentions to take over the domestic markets in Turkey, especially in green technologies, renewable energies, EV, and digital technologies as well. So that's one risk that Turkey perceives. So what Turkey is doing to prevent that is to impose protectionist measures, to tariffs, even at the expense of, at times, WTO rules, in order to prevent the Chinese takeover of the domestic markets. But there's a difference of opinion between the state and business elites, state and the capital, when it comes to China's entry to the Turkish domestic markets in these high technologies, because the business actually welcomes the opportunity to engage in joint ventures or Chinese investments in local enterprises in order to borrow the Chinese technologies or make use of the Chinese capital to develop local capacity in new technologies, whereas the state sees it as a security threat, basically, to the independence or the economic autonomy of the country. So there's again this difference of opinion within among the domestic actors in China. The second risk that Turkey perceives is the rivalry in the export markets of Turkey, the traditional export markets, which is the European markets. And the other neighborhoods like Central Asia and Africa. So as Julia just mentioned, China is taking over the European markets as well. And even though Turkey is not a competitor in high technologies, China is a rival to Turkey in low technology manufacturing goods going into Europe. So that's one risk. And Central Asia and Africa are two global South regions in Turkey's close neighborhood that China has an increasing influence. So in these two regions, we see these two countries, one regional, one extra-regional, are competing. And the third risk, I will say, is China's exclusion of Turkey from the BRI, both in terms of high technologies, but also in terms of its regional endeavors as well. And for that, I want to mention the connectivity, one of the primary aspects of the BRI. Turkey is situated on the routes that China would like to establish a China controlled global supply chains between China and Europe through landlines that go through Central Asia and maritime routes that go through Southeast Asia and the Middle East, all the way to Europe. And Turkey has its own aspirations too, such as the Middle Corridor that goes through the Caucasus and Central Asia. And it has been trying to merge its own middle corridor with China's BRI to no avail up until now, actually. There are some technical issues that prevents this merging of these two projects, but there's also China's unwillingness to have Turkey as a major regional power in Central Asia. So China has been opposing to Turkey's membership to Shanghai Cooperation Organization for that reason, for example. And for that reason, and for that, I'm gonna go back to Cobus's point of the global South being forced to choose between China and the West in terms of global supply chains. Turkey being excluded by China from the BRI designs is actually willing to cooperate with the West in this delinking endeavor. Out of necessity, not by choice. And a case in point for that is Turkey's warm response to IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor that was proposed as a rival to the maritime BRI, basically. I personally don't think that we can actually separate, we can delink the global supply chains. All the countries and regions are inevitably combined together in the global production networks. So IMEC is not necessarily a black and white level rival or alternative to the maritime BRI, but as a political rhetoric, it is promoted as such, and Turkey is actually joining the camp of praising the IMEC over the BRI. Again, simply because it is not included in the BRI system, BRI designs. So from that, I can respond to your comment about putting China and Russia together in the same basket. I actually do agree with the Chinese commentators you talk with in Beijing, in China, that China and Russia are not partners in crime, pun unintended, as it was in the case of Cold War years, for example. Despite what the US is promoting, I don't think that we are experiencing a second Cold War. None of the third parties, the global South countries, are willing to choose sides between two camps, actually, and therefore China acts on its own national interest, and Russia, and also China sees itself as a global power, whereas sees Russia only as a regional power. In Central Asia, not as its equal, right? And therefore, China's relationship with Russia is only pragmatic and interest-based. So there's no such thing as an full support for the Ukraine war, for example. Like when the war first started, the first thing the Chinese SOEs, state-owned enterprises, and banks did was to pull out of Russia so that they will not be subjected to secondary embargoes, restrictions imposed on Russia, right? So it was a very pragmatic move. So what China does is to support Russia in terms of political rhetoric, mentioning anti-imperialism and Western domination and whatnot. It is a very useful tool to promote China's political discourse, right? To talk about Western imperialism and whatnot. But when it comes to the practical, pragmatic economic interests, China is not necessarily, providing unconditional support to Russia, neither in the Ukraine war nor in the region, I think. And when it comes to Turkey, it does not see China and Russia as the same bloc. I see in being based in Europe, being based in Brussels, I get a lot of quests or proposals about how to protect Turkey from the China-Russia axis, in quotation marks, right? Well, what I always say is that there's no China-Russia axis when it comes to Turkey. Turkey has its own relationship with Russia as a regional power, and also its own relationship with China as a global power, which is trying to, of course, get involved in the regional matters, both in Central Asia and the Middle East, but still they're not, in the same basket for Turkey.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Siran. Let me now turn to Dr. Samtam, who is associate professor at Tetsu College in India. Dr. Samtam, I wonder if you have any response to any of the views expressed by the panel, please.
Okay, thank you. I was actually very interested in listening more from our speakers today, actually. From so far from the discussions that we have had and what the speakers had to say, there was some common theme that kept propping up every now and then. And maybe it is just me, maybe due to my limited knowledge, I may not be that often acute, observer to see things where there is, where we should be seeing things. But then there was this underlying theme about threats. To view the rise of China as a threat, because whenever the speakers, they use the word opportunities, or like, for instance, mixed feeling, or like duality, multipolarity, balancing, I was thinking, maybe are we not, like, in a sense, do we always have to view a rise of China from a very either or perspective? Do we always have to view China, the rise of China, as a threat? Or is it because of some other factors which I cannot definitely put a finger on it? Because there's always, why do we always view, I mean, like, even for instance, from what Kobus have said, or Julia has said, or Seren has said, there's always this mixed feeling, right? There's always this issue of mixed feeling, then asking the developing states to force to choose sides, right? Is it? I'm just trying to find, because it is. Are we not trying to create a tiger where there's no tiger? That's just my question. Because yesterday, it's ironic, because yesterday I took my students to meet some insurgent leaders here in Northeast India, right? So. And then we had a very fruitful discussion, because it was a field visit, where our students can learn more about, the conflicts that happens, in real world. So what we met the general, we met the chief of the army of that group, and what that army general told us was that you have to create tiger, right? You have to create a tiger where there is none, so that you get something out of it. So are the states, developing states, for instance, or be it Turkey or South Africa or Germany or Western Europe, or name any country in the world right now, even in the Southeast Asian countries, right? Are they not trying to create a tiger so that they benefit out of both China and and the West? So something to that. I would like to hear a response from all the three speakers. I'm not sure if if my question makes sense or not, but yeah.
Okay, can I get a response from any of the three panelists?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in first, because
Please.
I mean, I completely agree that it would be too easy to just frame China in this one context, and I come back to the approach that in the end is actually most of the time criticized by Chinese interlocutors, that the European Union and also Germany have, seeing China as a partner, but also as a rival and a competitor. So it's actually threefold. It's not only a threat, so not only a rival. It's also a partner and a competitor. And I think what is the benefit of this approach is that it tries to catch the complexity of the relationship. And I mean, also in India, right? You have very difficult relations with China, but still it's an important economic partner. And I think this is true for many countries. So it's a complex, it's a more complex relationship, and it wouldn't be correct just to characterize China as a threat. So this is from a European and German perspective, what at least in theory we try to do. So when the chancellor travels to China, he tries to or he tried to manage quite a few trade deals. If he got all of them, I doubt it, or we can see that he didn't. But it's an approach, despite the maybe criticism in Germany and the threat perception that I've raised before. There is also, of course, this partnership perspective and the knowledge that we are also benefiting from the rise of China and the fact that we are cooperating. But I think with the Rise Connected, at least here in Europe, there is always the feeling that we need to work on creating level playing field, for example, so that the Rise also in the future continues to be beneficial. I hope that's kind of.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you. And I want to ask this question also, and this can be Dr. Seren or Cobus or Julia can respond to this. There is a feeling of insecurity from the west towards China, yeah, and the question is this: what would it take for this sense of insecurity and rivalry on the part of the Western world to end with regard to China, right? Again, this is something that I hear in discussions. The Chinese officials been asking, or Chinese speakers been asking, what do you want us to do so that this rivalry ends, right? And I don't seem to ever get a straight answer out of this, right? But it's an important question, right? Does China need to crumble, or China needs to bow, or China needs to change this or that? Again, I don't have the answer, right? But what would that answer be for example, the United States or Europe to say, okay, rivalry ends because you've done this. So what would that be? Yeah. Dr. Cobus, you want to start with this, and then Dr. Seren, yeah. And Julia, if you want to add on to this, it would be great. Please.
Absolutely. So it's a very good question, and I think it's a very difficult question. Partly because, particularly, I think in the United States, there's an additional issue around accepting the loss of global leadership, of structural global leadership in some kind of way. So, so there's I think just a kind of a very strong resistance among US policymakers to be number two in the world, to be the second largest economy, or or to be sharing norm setting, or to in that kind of way, and at the moment that like those anxieties are communicated in terms of narratives of China, for example, exporting authoritarianism or supporting authoritarian countries around the world, or kind of like dismantling kind of liberal norms. And like that's a kind of a complicated issue, right? Kind of like there's a lot to unpack there, and kind of what authoritarian means in that particular context, what support means in that context, and kind of and so on. So so on the one hand, I think from the South African perspective, some of the changes that China is proposing in the global order, for example, like the China has been campaigning for a while around defining development, the right to development as a human right, for example, which kind of which the United States has opposed, partly kind of out of fear of state overreach, of states using, kind of using that right to development as a way to then crack down on individual property rights or rights of other kind of socioeconomic, socio-political rights and civil rights in countries. So, so I can definitely see that worry. On the other hand, I think, what we're seeing at the moment, I think, is that one of the strongest challenges, even as we're seeing the rise of a rhetoric about how China is dismantling a liberal international order, which I think has become a very dominant kind of theme both in Europe and in the United States. What we're seeing, I think, on the ground is that no one is dismantling liberal norms more quickly than liberal Western democracies, unfortunately. So for example, South Africa, kind of took a lot of inspiration from Western powers to enshrine LGBT rights, like lesbian, gay, and kind of and other forms of sexual minority rights in its constitution. So, for example, gay marriage is a legal right in South Africa's constitution, post-apartheid constitution, and that has largely come through the intellectual heritage of Western liberalism. Kind of like Western liberalism has been much the most instrumental, I think, in kind of in enshrining LGBT plus rights as a global norm. And South Africa benefited from that, and South Africans benefit from that today. Yet at the moment, with the largest amount of like anti-LGBT kind of dismantling of those norms are coming from countries like the United States and from the United Kingdom in terms of all kinds of targeted anti-trans legislation, kind of popping up all over at, kind of on the state level in the US, at the civic level, up to, kind of increasingly pushed all the way up, kind of to the Supreme Court. So, kind of like in that sense, it's not China dismantling liberalism, right? It's kind of like liberalism is being eaten from within, kind of kind of as there's a kind of a rise of right-wing kind of sentiments in the US and in Europe. So in that sense, kind of like but we're still living with this kind of the contradiction of, on the one hand, that happening, and on the other hand, a very strong narrative of China somehow dismantling liberalism, but then also very strong anti-liberal tendencies within China. So LGBT communities within China are being cracked down by the Xi Jinping administration. So it is this kind of really kind of confusing situation, I think, kind of where kind of where there's a strong, very strong narratives and talking points around these issues, and then somewhat contradictory issues on the ground. So that's a somewhat long-winded way of saying that I think the liberal international order, if it really fully enjoyed the support from its original champions and originators, would be in much better state, I think, than it is now, kind of despite whatever China's doing. And I think that ends up being, particularly in an African context, and of course, for African, I think, and this is Seren's points was very, very interesting in that sense of like, having lived with Russia across the board, very close, in the same neighborhood, is different from having enjoyed Russian support during the Cold War, as Africa had. So there's just a different viewpoint there. It's a different perspective. It's also very, very different from being a country like the Philippines, that's right across the dash line from China, compared to being Africa that's far away from China. So that that's just a different situation. In Africa's kind of like perspective, Africa has been in very, very close relationship with Europe and Western power for a long time. And that has not particularly boosted development, for example, in Africa. Kind of like that experience from an African perspective has been quite negative, and frequently there has been the experience of being very marginalized from global systems. So from that perspective, I think all of this discussion about the kind of dismantling of a liberal order, or the kind of anxieties about that being expressed in Western countries, just play very differently in Africa. who has, you know, kind of like at the moment of like peak unipolar power, you know, and among Western countries in the 90s and 2000s, Africa was at that moment undergoing structural adjustment programs, was undergoing like huge economic kind of impacts that were largely, you know, kind of coming from decisions that ended up being made in Western capitals. So in that sense, I guess, you know, kind of Africa sits in this kind of weird position where it's, you know, kind of where it's seeing this kind of drama of the anxiety kind of playing out, you know, kind of in Western capitals around the rise of China, while at the same time seeing that from a completely kind of like upside down perspective, you know. So I think in that sense, it like, you know, I think there's a lot more. I think the slipping of Western power, or the shifting of Western power, I think looks very different from the global South, you know, and I think that's maybe not the extent to which the global South is still so fully dependent on Western power, has been for up to, you know, up to the last little bit, has really shaped that view. And I think that there's a real kind of difference of perspective, I think, there between a place like Africa and you know, kind of region like the West.
Thank you. Let me just move on to the next question to Dr. Siren. President Xi Jinping has frequently talked about China must be free to choose its own path of development. And he's saying that not just China, but any country. And I think the reason why he's saying this is the response to what the Chinese see as Western, what do you call it, a push for universal values, democracy, human rights, and other principles. I think that was the context of his statement on choosing the freedom to choose its own development path. I'm just wondering, how is this concept being received from countries like Turkey? Is that are you skeptical, or is it something that you can?
Okay, I just unmuted myself. Yeah, that's a very good question, and it is related to the previous question about creating a tiger too, right? So Xi Jinping's political rhetoric of a new kind of development actually provides a leeway for the global South's governments, and less so to popular movements, mass movements, like the labor and the youth and whatnot in the global South. I think that political rhetoric has two dimensions. One is the creating a room for normative values other than Western liberal order of plurality, electoral democracy, and basic political human rights, right? And these are all conditionalities of Western economic aid to global South, right? So these two are closely linked in the Western system, whereas China suggests delinking political developments from economic aid, and B, a different set of political values, like replacing collective human rights, like right to shelter, right to food, right to education, with individual political rights, right to freedom of speech, freedom of association, and whatnot, right? So there's that. And that is welcome by at least certain global South governments, right? And when it comes to Turkey, since Turkey also is under an authoritarian, illiberal government for the last 2 decades, of course, Turkey picks and chooses from this overall political rhetoric and uses it for its own benefits. The second dimension of Xi Jinping's the Global Development Initiative or Global Civilizational Initiative and whatnot is, I think, state capitalism. China does not offer an economic order outside of the capitalist system. It is definitely within the global capitalist system. And I will say, in many aspects, global neoliberal capitalist system when it comes to the labor regime, for example. China's labor regime, both domestically and internationally, is very insecure, very precarious, like the Western labor regimes. But when it comes to industrial policy making and implementation, it is on the state capitalism side of things. It is still big on macro planning, done and steered, if not directly implemented by the state. And through BRI and other global initiatives, it is promoting this idea, and it is the reception of this idea of the state-steered industrial development is variegated, depending on the domestic conditions of the countries or regions. There are some countries that are more has better capacity to actually have establish an equal relationship with China. Like if I talk about Turkey's immediate region, Israel, for example, right, or Southern European countries are in a better position to have a more equal relationship with China, whereas countries with lesser economic capacity and less stable political situation like Egypt or Syria and whatnot are more dependent on China on that. For Turkey, the state-led industrial development is also unequal because China doesn't have its own sorry, not China, but Turkey doesn't have its own well-defined industrial policy. So it's creates a dependency to China in these issue areas. So to sum up, I think Turkey's response to the new kind of developments promoted by Xi Jinping and China is also variegated domestically, that in some issue areas it welcomes, especially in political dimensions, and in economic terms, it is less receptive of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Siren. Before I take some questions, we still got about 18 minutes left. Maybe I'll go back to Julia. Julia, you heard Dr. Kobus spoke about the perception towards the West from the global South. And definitely there's a difference between the way the West sees global South and then, West sees China and global South countries see China. What explains the gap, this perception gap, you think?
Well, maybe I can start with some numbers, as we already have them, because we did a report at Körperstiftung with where we did some surveys, some polling in India, Brazil, and South Africa, and also in Germany. And we have asked experts and policymakers, diplomats, journalists about their perception on different foreign policy issues. And one of the issues was their perception of China. And what we found in the survey was that if you ask Indian experts, 86% of them, they perceive China's influence in their country rather as negative. this kind of aligns with the perception in Germany, where 90% of experts shared the same view. Now, when you look at South Africa and Brazil, views are more positive. I think after this one and a bit hour that we spent together, people might not be surprised about that because we've talked about it quite a lot. In Brazil, 78% of experts, they have a positive view on China. So it's more or less the opposite compared to India and Germany. And in South Africa, also 62% of experts have a positive view on China's influence in their country. So these are the numbers. I mean, we always have the feeling that this might be the case, but our survey results on emerging middle powers, they show that this is actually the case in the community of experts and decision makers. Now, how can we explain this? I think we have talked about some of the reasons already. Kobus has mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. And I myself, we didn't include Indonesia in the survey, but I myself, as Dino, as you know, because you've welcomed me in your office, I have traveled to Indonesia and just came back 2 weeks ago. And I have used one of the Chinese infrastructure products, namely the Whoosh, so the fast train from Jakarta to Bandung. And it's one of the, I think it's one of the projects that shows the visibility of what China is in the perception maybe of many Indonesians, and this you know better, Dino, than I do, but that China is kind of implementing projects. There's infrastructure. It is labeled with the Chinese logo also. When you travel with the Whoosh, you will see President Xi Jinping and President Jokowi from Indonesia shaking hands for 30 minutes. So it's a very good branding also involved with the Belt and Road Initiative, apart from the fact that China delivers infrastructure that is needed in many of those countries. From Brazil, I know from some field research that due to China's economic importance and the opportunities, and this is something that Kobus has also mentioned in his initial statement, that China is seen as an opportunity. So, and I think this is also true for Brazil and other countries, because China offers these infrastructure products. Now, if you look a little bit more closer at these projects, of course, there's also a downside. There's researchers looking at debt traps. And if you look at the case of Sri Lanka, for example, there's also some problems attached to that. But I think the branding is very good, and this has a huge impact on the perception also of countries like of experts and also the broader population in countries like Brazil, South Africa, and probably also Indonesia, if we look at surveys coming from there. So I think this is a very good tool of the Chinese government to also increase the positive perception of bilateral relations with China.
Yeah, thank you. And I do see that coming from Indonesia and Southeast Asia, that the Chinese have become very, very competitive in terms of trying to engage the world, right? In terms of trying to win public opinion outside China, right? The public diplomacy programs, I think, exceeds those of other countries. Their diplomatic initiatives, and if they hold the China Africa Summit, for example, or China ASEAN Summit in China, everybody comes, right? And the Chinese have said that look, any country that comes to China, any leader, they get at least 1 hour or half hour for the Chinese leader, and it's just showing that they're really become very competitive in trying to, with the shortcomings that they still have, to try to embrace and attract countries outside China. So I just wanted to make that point. And in Southeast Asia, the political baggage that we had about China, we had serious political baggage. Tunisia was quite hostile to China for 2 decades. That's largely been gone up some reason. And this is why we were able to establish a comprehensive strategic partnership with China. But obviously, China treats Indonesia and Southeast Asia differently than they treat the West, right? So that's interesting. I will take a question from Reza Hashim, who asks, does China support a reform in its partner countries in terms of relationship with those countries? Does anyone want to take on that question? Anyone? So the question from Reza: when China established relationship with a country, does China necessarily support reform program in those countries, or does China simply say reform is none of our concern? I don't know. Maybe Cobus, you want to take on with this?
In general, obviously, Chinese foreign policy is governed by this very strong, like, rhetorical commitment to non-intervention, except where it comes to issues particularly relating to China, like support for Taiwan, of course. So in that sense, kind of like, I think China on certain key issues, China does push for reform or change. But along relatively kind of like narrow lines. I think in general, Chinese engagement, I think is kind of like tends to kind of to leave kind of domestic issues to those governments and to stay quite kind of kind of agnostic about it. Kind of unfrequently also to then kind of overlook whatever other problems there are in the country, kind of like kind of displacements of human rights abuses or whatever, like a lot of kind of that tends to fall under the general category of not internal issues in that country, and not kind of China's kind of position or China's place to comment on. But I think at the same time, China's also working very hard to try and set up forums for alternative collective decision making, where its own ideas are like have a stronger voice. Kind of kind of global internet reform, for example, is a big example. And there, kind of that then has the knock-on effect sometimes of shaping norms in countries, kind of indirectly, without necessarily putting sanctions or putting direct pressure on these countries to change it. China's operation in these platforms tend to kind of shift, just to set entire new sets of norms, or entire kind of new norm narratives, around, for example, government sovereignty over national internet, for example, or like, kind of so we've seen then kind of knock on, kind of changes or reforms happening in, for example, some African countries around a kind of a narrative setting, around alternative norms coming from China. So it's a kind of a complicated yes and no kind of situation, to my mind.
Okay. There's a question from Dean from the Netherlands. A question to Julia. You mentioned that Germany's trade volume is very high. Meanwhile, Germany's strategic paper on China fundamentally highlighted for de-risking. What is the process? What is the progress of Germany de-risking from China? Is Germany having a hard time de-risking itself from China? And also, this question from August in Hong Kong, two Cobras. How does the U.S. react to South African involvement in BRICS, which draws it closer to China? Are you facing any pressure on that? Okay, maybe Julia first.
Yeah, thank you to Dean for this question, because it's really one of the key questions at the moment also that is discussed in Germany, because we have this strategy that focuses a lot on de-risking, and now the question is what is happening? Is it just a rhetoric instrument, or is there happening something in practice? And I would say at best, there are first signs of, for example, import side de-risking emerging. And when we look at some sectors, for example, the manufacturing sector, when we look at numbers, there is kind of a decreasing seeing here, but there's absolutely no appetite for huge de-risking when we look at the big players that are present in the Chinese market, such as BASF or Bayer or Volkswagen. So they still invest a lot, and I think the small and medium enterprises, they are more into de-risking and focusing more on that and are further in this process than the big players. And I also think that maybe but we really need to wait a little bit longer and then look closely at effects and research numbers, and then also include other causes that might not be due to a strategic decision to de-risk, but to economic development in general. Because if imports and exports decline, this does not necessarily mean that there is some strategic decision that was taken to de-risk, but can be also something else. So I think it will take a bit more time to really have a complete analysis on this. But my current opinion on this would be that the peak of the risking and the interest in the risking was really when we published the China strategy. And looking at the latest trip of the German chancellor to China, I get the feeling that maybe there's other priorities at the moment already. I don't know if priorities reshift, but it seems to me that the very peak of the risking might have passed already in a rhetoric sense.
Okay, Cobus?
So it's a very interesting question.
On the BRICS, yeah, go ahead, please.
So, so August asked, has South Africa's involvement in BRICS affected its relationship with both China and the US? And does it have leverage on China in the framework of BRICS? And how is the US reacting? So in terms of South Africa's leverage, I think in BRICS, I don't think so. South Africa is a small country and a small economy, so there's a limit to how much leverage it can have over a state the size of China. I think BRICS has provided South Africa a much closer relationship with China, but I think to a certain extent, that reflects the strong diplomatic relationship or the role that South Africa plays in China's relationship with the entire African continent. So I think it did strengthen South Africa's relationship with China, but I don't think South Africa has any kind of specific kind of special leverage over China, and kind of in that context. It just, I think, has an additional kind of channel of communication, I think, with China. What the US, I think, has reacted negatively to the BRICS membership, but I think more negatively. The situation in Israel and South Africa's kind of engagement there, I think, has sharpened that reaction in the US. So I think it wasn't the BRICS membership alone. There's been a lot of discussion in Western countries and around the world around the possibility of BRICS being a factor in de-dollarization, or not, kind of like a shift away from Western financial institutions, as August mentioned. I think in practice that discussion is premature. What we've seen so far is just a stronger focus on local currency, kind of dealings within the BRICS, but it doesn't necessarily represent any kind of like fundamental kind of like decentering of the dollar yet. Kind of, I think it's still very early days. But I think the reaction from the US has been more sharp around perceptions of South Africa being too close to Russia, and then South Africa's kind of intervention around the International Criminal Court into the Gaza controversy. And there, I think that has raised some quite kind of sharp anti-South African kind of positions within the US. And I think South Africa is somewhat nervously kind of waiting to see how the US election is going to play out, to see, kind of how that's going to develop in the future.
Thank you. My last question is to Dr. Seren, and I'm sorry, we only have like 4 minutes left. But I want to pick up on your earlier point in the beginning when you mentioned that Turkey, one stumbling block was the question of Uyghur in China. Uh, has Does Turkey include this issue in bilateral talks with China, or do you avoid it? Or if you mention it, what has been the Chinese response? Is it none of your business, or hey, we can listen to you, maybe have some good advice here. So, what is the response?
It's actually more like China that includes this as a talking point in the bilateral negotiations. Since China has a bigger economy than Turkey, it has more leverage on Turkey actually. So it is brought up by China every single time that Turkey should stick to the one China policy and non-intervention in domestic affairs and whatnot. And the Turkish government feels the obligation to reiterate that it respects China's non-intervention in China's domestic affairs and whatnot, and always faces criticism domestically from the Uyghur diaspora, the public that supports the Uyghur diaspora, and the opposition parties that, of course, use this point against the governments. So, to be fair, I guess Turkey is much more vocal on the Uyghur issue than many of the other Muslim countries in the region, in the Middle Eastern region, like many Gulf countries, for example, already announced their unconditional support to the Chinese state on the Uyghur issue. Turkey is still trying to seek a balance internationally. One concession to China, for example, in bilateral relations is always followed up by some statement in an international body, for example, in the UN or the EU or whatnot. So Turkey is still trying to, to be somewhat vocal about the Uyghur issue, but it is not, the relationship is not equal with China in the sense that it can, impose any policy change or whatnot over China.
Okay, well, thank you. I think on that note, we will have to close this really interesting and fascinating discussion. I want to thank Kovos, Seren, and Julia really, really for your insight and candid views. I learned quite a lot, actually. And I think this is an issue that will be ongoing for quite some time. Not just perceptions, but relations with China will shift, up and down, forward and backward for many countries. But we do hope that between the West and China, the rivalry will somehow ease up. This is what we in Indonesia hope, because we think that there is a much greater agenda globally that we need to wrestle with, and we do count on China's contribution, also on the contribution of Western powers and also the global South. So I hope I'm not being naive in saying that. Again, thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you and future discussions. Let me turn the microphone to Giano. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Padino, for moderating the discussion. Also to Kovos, Dr. Seren, and Yulia for sharing your incredible insights. Before we wrap up the event, I would like to invite the speakers, the moderator, and participants for a short photo session. So everyone, let's turn on your cameras and have your brightest smile ready. Okay. Okay, just a few seconds more, waiting for everyone to turn on their cameras.
Please.
Okay, on my count, 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's take another one. And 1, 2, 3. All right, thank you so much, everyone, for joining
Thank
in
you,
this
everybody.
discussion, and I'm sure everyone has found the session very interesting and highly informative. For your information, today's event will be available for rewatch on FPCI's official YouTube channel at Secretariat FPCI. Additionally, you will see a link in the chat box for everyone to fill in and claim the e-certificates. Please make sure to fill in the details correctly, as the e-certificates will be sent to your emails. Once again, thank you everyone for tuning in to today's discussion. For more information about our events and program, you can follow our social media handles on Instagram at FPC Indo and at Global Town Hall. Also, do stay tuned for our next Global Town Hall series. See you at the next FPCI event. Thank you. Have a good day.